Oliver Twist. The Charles Dickens Children's Collection. In the workhouse. Oliver Twist was an orphan. His mother died on the very day he was born. No one knew who his father was. He was given the surname Twist by the beadle. The beadle, whose name was Mr. Bumble, was a kind of church policeman. He was responsible for finding homes for orphans and making sure they were taken care of. But Mr. Bumble didn't have much time for children. Oliver grew up in a baby farm. This was a place that looked after young children without parents. The local church paid for their care, but they didn't pay very much, certainly not enough for toys, cakes or Christmas trees, or any of the things that children enjoy. A woman called Mrs. Mann ran the baby farm. She was selfish and kept most of the money she was meant to spend on the children for herself. As a result, the children were always hungry and only had old, torn clothes that were always too big or too small. By the time Oliver Twist was 9 years old, he was a pale, thin child. But on the inside he was clever, kind and spirited. Now he was 9, he was too old to stay at the baby farm. Mr. Bumble came to take Oliver Ed off to the workhouse. This was where poor people were fed and sheltered, though not well, in exchange for work. Oliver's job was to unpick old tar-covered strands of ship's rope so the fiber could be used again. It was boring, and it hurt his hands. Oliver and the other boys who worked there were fed in a large stone hall. There was a great copper bowl at one end, and the workhouse master ladled gruel out of it at meal times. The gruel was a sort of watery porridge. The boys were allowed 1 ladle of gruel, no more. It was all they ate, except on special occasions when they each got a small piece of bread. For months, Oliver Twist and his companions slowly starved. At last, they got so desperate that they decided someone had to speak up, someone had to ask for more food. The task fell to Oliver Twist. The evening arrived, and the boys took their places. The master, in his cook's uniform, stationed himself by the copper bowl. The gruel was served. The gruel was eaten up, every last watery drop of it. The boys whispered to each other, and winked at Oliver. 2 of them nudged him. Oliver was desperate from hunger and misery. He rose from the table, bowl and spoon in hand, and walked up to the master. "Please, sir, I want some more," he said. The master turned very pale. He gazed in shock at Oliver for some seconds. The boys in the hall were shaking with fear. "What?" bellowed the master in disbelief. "Please, sir," replied Oliver, "I want some more." The master hit Oliver on the head with the ladle, and shrieked for Mr. Bumble. The beadle dragged Oliver off to the gentleman who ran the workhouse. They all looked well-fed and well-dressed, unlike Oliver. These gentlemen were in a very important meeting when Mr. Bumble entered. He announced with a roar, "I beg your pardon, sirs. Oliver Twist has asked for more." Every face looked round in horror. "For more," said one gentleman who was wearing a white waistcoat. "Do I understand that he asked for more after he had eaten his ration of supper?" "He did, sir," replied Bumble. "This boy will be come to a bad end," said the gentleman. "I know he will." They ordered Oliver to be locked up overnight. The next morning a poster was put up outside. It offered £5 to anybody who would take Oliver Twist away with them. Soon enough, they found someone willing to take Oliver. Mr. Sowerberry was an undertaker. He was a tall, gaunt man, dressed in a threadbare black suit. He thought Oliver could be useful to him, sweeping and cleaning in the workshop where the coffins were made. Mr. Sowerberry was not an unkind man. In a way, Oliver's life with him was better than in the workhouse, even though he had to sleep in a room full of half-built coffins. On the other hand, Mr. Sowerberry's wife lived up to their name. She was sour and bad-tempered, and didn't like Oliver at all. There was another young assistant called Noah who thought he was far better than Oliver. He teased and mocked the young boy by calling him workhouse and insulting Oliver's mother. She was a bad un, he said, a regular right-down bad un. Oliver could not remember his mother. He didn't even know her name, but he was very protective of her. One day Noah's teasing and taunting went too far and they fought. Oliver won. Noah complained to Mr. and Mrs. Sowerberry. The Sowerberrys faced Oliver like judges. Noah called my mother names, said Oliver. That's why I hit him. So what if he did, said Mrs. Sowerberry. Your mother deserved what he said, and worse. She didn't, said Oliver. She did, said Mrs. Sowerberry. It's a lie, shouted Oliver. Mrs. Sowerberry burst into a flood of tears. Mr. Sowerberry was forced to take action. He hit Oliver several times, and then sent him off to bed in the coffin workshop. Once he was by himself, Oliver decided that there was nothing for him here. No family. No future. He had to escape. At Fagins's. As the first rays of the sun struggled through the shutters in the workshop, Oliver got up. He quietly unlocked the door to the street and then paused. Left or right? He turned left, walked up a hill, and then cut across some fields. He passed Mrs. Mann's baby farm with a shutter and arrived at a high road. He sat down by a milestone. It said, London 70 miles. But that was all right. Oliver was determined to seek his fortune far away. He survived the next few days thanks to the kindness of a road mender, who gave him some bread and cheese, and an old woman, who gave him a little money. On the 7th morning, Oliver limped into the town of Barnet, near to London. He sank down on a doorstep. He was exhausted. After a time, he noticed a boy of about his age staring at him. The boy was short, with a snub nose and sharp little eyes. "Hello," he said to Oliver. "What's the news?" "I'm very hungry and tired," replied Oliver. "I have been walking for 7 days." "Walking for 7 days," said the boy. "Then you'll want some grub, and you shall have it." He bought Oliver some ham and a loaf of bread at a nearby shop. Oliver discovered his new friend's name was Jack Dawkins, although most people called him the Artful Dodger. "Going to London?" asked Jack. "Yes," said Oliver. "Got anywhere to stay?" "No." "Money?" "No, I've got to be in London tonight and I know a respectable old gentleman who lives there," said Jack. "He'll give you somewhere to sleep for nothing." Jack and Oliver spent the whole day walking to London. By 7 o'clock that evening they arrived in a particularly dirty part of the city. The streets were narrow and muddy. Men and women lounged in doorways. Babies screamed inside the rundown houses, and children scurried about everywhere. Oliver was thinking of running away again, but then Jack grabbed him by the arm and steered him into one of the houses. A rough-looking man stuck his head out of a door at the end of a passage. He was holding a candle. There was a woman behind him. "Why, it's the Dodger," the woman said. "Hello, Nance," said Jack. "There's 2 of you," growled the man. Who's the other one? A new pal, said Jack. Is Fagin upstairs? He's sorting out the loot, said the man. The two boys climbed a dark, rickety staircase. At the top, Jack threw open a door. The room behind it was black with dirt and soot. Sitting around a table were 4 boys of about Oliver's age. Against the far wall there were beds made out of old sacking. A wrinkled old man was cooking sausages with a toasting fork by the fire. He had matted red hair and wore a greasy coat. Fagin, said Jack to the old man, this is my friend, Oliver Twist. Fagin made a bow in Oliver's direction. Very glad to see you, my dear, he said. The boys welcomed him too. They shook his hand, helped him take his coat and hat off, and even tried to empty his pockets for him. This help was not needed as Oliver's pockets were empty. The table was littered with handkerchiefs. Fagin noticed Oliver staring at them and said, We've just got him out ready for the wash, that's all, Oliver. Ha ha ha. Was this the loot the man downstairs had mentioned? Oliver was confused but, above all, he was hungry. He ate his share of the sausages with gusto. The food, together with the long day's walk, made him drowsy. He sank down on one of the piles of sacking. Soon, he was sound asleep. The boys were out of the room most of each day. They were friendly. It was almost as if they were all part of one big family. They came back with assorted items like handkerchiefs, wallets, watch chains, and sometimes even watches. Fagin would examine all these items, and sometimes praise the boy who'd brought them for his workmanship. He got very angry if a boy came back with nothing, however. How did they have the time to make these things? Oliver didn't know. Oliver was a little frightened of W. Fagin, even though the old man was giving him food and shelter. He was much more frightened of the man downstairs, whose name was Bill Sikes. Sikes had a violent temper. The boys often heard the sounds of arguing between him and the woman, who was called Nancy. Like everyone, Nancy was frightened of Sikes, but she seemed to love him too. She was kind to Oliver. She smiled at him and asked him how he was doing. Oliver wasn't sure how to answer, but it was nice to be asked. From things he overheard, Oliver realized that Sikes and Fagin were in business together. But what kind of business? Oliver found the answer about a week after he'd first arrived at Fagin's. He was out walking with Jack, whom he now called the Artful Dodger like everyone else, and a boy called Charlie. Suddenly the Dodger stopped. See that gent by the bookstall, he said. The one in the green coat? He'll do, said Charlie. Oliver stood and watched as his friends crept up behind the man in the green coat. He was reading a book from the stall. Oliver was horrified to see the Dodger plunge his hand into the gentleman's pocket and draw out a handkerchief. In an instant Oliver realized just what it was the boys did each and every day. This was where all the handkerchiefs and notebooks and watches came from. His new friends were pickpockets and thieves. Oliver stood there, both horrified and amazed. Unfortunately, the gentleman reached for his pocket at that very moment and saw what was happening. The two boys ran as fast as they could. So did Oliver. But he wasn't as quick or experienced as the others. By the time the cry "Stop thief" went up, the Dodger and Charlie vanished. But Oliver was hardly round the first corner when he was knocked down by a huge man. A crowd gathered. Oliver lay on the ground covered in mud and dust. The crowd parted to let through the gentleman from the bookstall and a police officer. Yes, said the gentleman, "that is the boy." But he did not look angry. He was staring at Oliver as if trying to remember where he'd seen him before. The officer seized Oliver by the collar and dragged him up. "It wasn't me, sir," said Oliver. "That's what they all say," said the officer. At Mr. Brownlow's. The next few hours passed in a blur. Oliver was taken to a police station, and then to court. The only witness to the robbery was Mr. Brownlow, the gentleman whose handkerchief had been stolen. But instead of accusing Oliver of being the thief or one of the thieves, Mr. Brownlow said that the boy was innocent. The case was dismissed and Oliver was told to go. When Mr. Brownlow left the courtroom a few moments later, he saw Oliver lying on the pavement, white-faced and trembling. "Poor boy," said Mr. Brownlow, bending over him. "Someone call a cab, quickly." Oliver, hardly aware of what was happening, lay on the cab seat. Mr. Brownlow clambered inside. Despite the clatter of the cab and the thud of the horse's hoofs, Oliver fell asleep. Oliver woke in a warm, comfortable bedroom. An old woman was looking at him. He tried to sit up, but she said softly, "Hush, my dear. You must be quiet or you will be ill again." "Have I been ill?" he asked. "You've had a fever, but the worst is over." The door opened and a man walked in. Oliver recognized Mr. Brownlow. He smiled to see Oliver awake. He came to the bedside and looked at Oliver. But all he said was, "You have got some color back in your cheeks, I'm glad to say." Over the next few days, Oliver recovered his strength. He discovered he was in John Brownlow's house. The old lady was his housekeeper. They were very kind people, and they were especially concerned about Oliver. Oliver was fed well and allowed to sleep in as late as he liked. He was treated better than ever before in his life. Mr. Brownlow even bought him a fresh set of clothes. Sometimes, Oliver had nightmares about his past life. He said nothing of this to Mr. Brownlow or the kindly housekeeper. As far as they were concerned, Oliver was safe and happy now. One day, Oliver was with Mr. Brownlow in the study. It was full of books and there were pictures on the wall. One of the pictures was of a beautiful lady. Something about her face was familiar, though Oliver did not know exactly what. Mr. Brownlow looked slowly at Oliver, then at the portrait. He shook himself and started talking about the books in the room. Oliver would read them one day, he said. Mr. Brownlow clapped his hand to his forehead suddenly. "What's the matter, sir?" said Oliver, who was very respectful to the man who had rescued him. "Good heavens, I never paid him," said Mr. Brownlow. "That book is still in my coat pocket." In the confusion over the theft of his handkerchief at the bookstall, Mr. Brownlow had slipped the book he was reading into his pocket. He had never paid the bookseller. Mr. Brownlow was horrified. He needed to pay at once. "I'll go, sir," said Oliver. He was desperate to do something nice for the man who had been so kind to him. "If you'll trust me with the money, that is." "Of course I trust you, Oliver. But you have been ill, you know. You shouldn't be running about." "I'm better now," said Oliver. It was true, he was better and felt stronger than ever before. Mr. 18 Brownlow gave him £5 and a letter for the bookseller. With the money and note tucked in his new jacket, Oliver set off through streets he hadn't trodden for several weeks. At Fagin's again. Fagin and Bill Sikes hadn't forgotten Oliver. Sikes had plans for the boy. Sykes's specialty was breaking into rich people's houses at night. Oliver was a small boy, just the right size to slip through a narrow window where bigger boys might get stuck. Yes, Sykes had big plans for Oliver. Fagin and Bill were also worried. They knew Oliver had been arrested and dragged to the magistrate's court. They knew he had then been taken to Mr. Brownlow's because a couple of Fagin's boys had run after the cab to see where it was going. What they didn't know was what Oliver was saying. He wasn't a hardened thief like the Dodger or Charlie. Those boys would have kept their mouths shut. But Oliver Twist might give them away at any time. He could even lead the police to their front door. They had to get their hands on Oliver before he did any damage. As long as the boy was at Mr. Brownlow's, he was safe. But the moment he was back on the street. As it happened, Oliver was already back on the street. In fact, he was racing through the streets. He thought only about paying the bookseller and racing back to Mr. Brownlow's with the change. He wanted to show how reliable and trustworthy he was. Suddenly he heard a woman cry, "It's Oliver." He recognized Nancy's voice before he saw her face. Too late he realized that Bill Sykes was with her. Sykes seized Oliver by the arm and started to drag him away. Nancy looked sorry to have called out Oliver's name. To the passers-by, who looked as though they might ask questions, Sykes growled, "This here's my boy." They half ran, half stumbled back towards the dirtier, poorer part of town. Oliver would have broken free if he could, but Sykes's grip was too tight. They were soon outside Fagin's lair. They made their way through the dark hall, up the rickety staircase, into the sooty room. Fagin was sitting at the table examining the usual handkerchiefs. His tangled red hair hung down either side of his face. Charlie and a couple of other boys were lounging in the corner. "I got him," said Sykes. "I am glad to see you again, my dear," said Fagin. "What you been doing, Oliver?" asked Charlie. Oliver said nothing. He thought about Mr. Brownlow. The kindly gentleman would be waiting for him to come back from the bookshop. When he didn't, Mr. Brownlow would think he had taken the money and run away. In Mr. Brownlow's eyes, Oliver would definitely be a thief. That thought was almost worse than being back in the hands of Fagin's gang. "Nice new rags you're wearing," said Sykes, feeling Oliver's coat. "And lots of brass too," said Charlie, extracting the £5 from Oliver's pocket. "Must be your reward for blabbing about us," said Sykes. "It's not mine," said Oliver. "No, it's ours now," said Charlie. "Who did you tell about this place?" demanded Sykes. "And then no one," stammered Oliver. Fagin snatched the coins away from Charlie. Then the old man gripped Oliver's shoulders with his claw-like hands. He bent low and whispered in Oliver's ear, "Just tell us, my dear." "I haven't said a thing," said Oliver. This was true. Nancy had been standing by silently. Now she said, Oliver wouldn't blab. "Hold your tongue, Nance," said Sykes. "Speak when you're asked." Sykes and Fagin went over to the fireplace and talked quietly. Then Fagin said to the whole room, "It's not safe here anymore. We're going to Jacob's Island." Jacob's Island. Jacob's Island was a piece of land near the London docks. It was surrounded by a muddy ditch that filled with water when the tide was in, making it a sort of island. Ramshackle old houses crowded Jacob's Island. They were so old that half of them had already fallen down while the other half seemed about to sink into the ditch, including the gang's new hideout. No one came here if they could help it. It was the safest place that Fagin and Sykes knew. The other boys came and went, but Oliver wasn't allowed to leave at all. He was kept in an upper room. There were 2 doors, but they were both locked. A window looked over the muddy ditch. It was so tiny that even Oliver couldn't squeeze through it. Nancy brought him bread and cheese with an occasional scrap of meat. "What's going to happen to me?" he asked her. In answer, Nancy put her arms round him. Oliver thought she was crying. This made him afraid for her, and for himself. Sometimes he heard voices arguing downstairs. Mostly it was Bill Sykes's voice, and once or twice it was Nancy's. 3 or 4 days passed like this. Then, one evening, as the sun was going down, the noise below reached a new pitch. Sykes was shouting and raging. Nancy shrieking. Then there was a sudden clatter and a thump. It sounded as if something or someone had fallen down hard. Now, there was a sinister silence. Oliver put his ear to the door. He could hear nothing but the rapid beating of his heart. He went to the tiny window. There was a rickety bridge across the ditch outside. It wasn't much more than a few planks tied together. The light was low, but Oliver saw a group of men crossing the bridge one at a time towards the house. There was a thunderous banging at the front door. Shouts of "Open up!" bellowed through the woodwork. A frantic scrabbling of keys unlocked the door to Oliver's room. The artful Dodger leapt inside. "What's happening?" said Oliver, panicked. "It's the Traps," said the Dodger. Traps was their slang word for the police. Bill thought Nance told the police about this place, so Bill's gone, and the rest of the sentence was drowned out by the banging and shouting from downstairs. It grew louder with every second. The Dodger ran to the other door, produced a key, and slipped through it as quick as lightning. Oliver never saw him again. Heavy steps came rapidly up the stairs. It was Bill Sykes's turn to burst into the room. His hair was stuck up in spikes, and he was carrying a coil of rope. Sykes looked at Oliver as if he'd never seen him before in his life. Then Sykes shoved him so hard in the chest that he fell down. Sykes stopped for a moment in the doorway where the Dodger had made his escape. Beyond him, Oliver could see the evening sky. Sykes said, "Every rat's got to have a hole to go to, boy?" The doorway led to a small ledge between the roofs of neighboring houses. Sykes looked around desperately, trying to decide what to do next. He made a noose out of the rope and aimed it at a chimney stack. He was going to try to lower himself into the ditch, which was now full with water from the returning tide. Oliver heard police down below. They had been joined by a shouting crowd. It was impossible to tell whether they were cheering Sykes on or jeering at him. From the doorway, Oliver saw Sykes's black figure silhouetted against the sunset sky. He saw him throwing the noose of the rope towards the chimney. He saw the loop fall short. Sykes lost his footing and tumbled off the edge of the roof. There was a roar from down below. Then there was absolute silence. Home. Oliver was once again at Mr. Brownlow's. This was where he would stay now. It was to be his home. It turned out that Nancy had gone to John Brownlow. She had feared for Oliver's life. Once he'd been taken to Jacob's Island. John Brownlow alerted the police to Fagin's hiding place, but it was Nancy who paid the price. Sykes had accused her of betraying them. He had killed her. Oliver often thought of Nancy, of how she had risked everything to save him. He was glad the artful Dodger had got away. Glad, too, in a way, that Fagin had been arrested. But there were new things to think about now. One day, Oliver was in Mr. Brownlow's study. He was gazing at the picture of the strangely familiar, beautiful young lady. Mr. Brownlow removed it from the wall and brought it closer for Oliver to see. He studied the two side by side, the boy's face and the young lady's. "You do not see the likeness?" he asked. "Ah, well, the one person you cannot see is yourself, Oliver. Here, take the picture." Mr. Brownlow explained that the woman was Oliver's aunt. Mr. Brownlow had been meant to marry her. Sadly, she had died before the wedding could take place. But she'd had a much younger, called Agnes, whom Mr. Brownlow remembered fondly. Though he lost touch with Agnes, he knew she had fallen on hard times and later had a child. Mr. Brownlow tried time and time again to find that child. He had given up hope when, one day, a group of boys tried to rob him at the bookstall. "The moment I saw you, Oliver, I knew there was something familiar about you. Even though you were covered in dirt and about to be taken away by a police officer. But I could not be sure. I had to make inquiries. I spoke to people from your past who knew more than they told you about your mother. And just when I was certain, you disappeared into Fagin's hands again." As Mr. Brownlow talked, his voice began to tremble. Oliver did not reply straight away. He could not. He traced the image of the lady's face in the picture with his finger. She was the link between him and his mother. His mother, Agnes. At last he knew her name.